There is a house standing in the mountains of North Carolina, and the first time you see it, your brain does something strange. It refuses for a moment to categorize what it is looking at. It is not a hotel. It is not a government building. It is not a cathedral, though it has the scale of one. It is a home, a single family's home with 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, 43 bathrooms, and more than 4 acres of floor space under one roof. It took over 1,000 workers 6 full years to build it. It required its own private 3-mile railroad just to deliver the materials to the site. The man who commissioned it was 25 years old when construction began, and he called it without any apparent irony his little mountain escape. His name was George Washington Vanderbilt II, and he was the grandson of the richest man in America. And here is the question that nobody in the 130 years since that house opened its doors has ever really stopped to ask. Not why they built it, not how much it cost, but why in the name of all reasonable human behavior, a family that already had more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes kept building and building and building and building until the buildings themselves consumed everything they had. Because Biltmore did not destroy the Vanderbilt family by being expensive to maintain, though it was. It consumed them along with a dozen other mansions, just like it, because every single one of those houses was an attempt to answer a question that no house could ever answer. A question so deep and so painful that the family spent 3 generations and the equivalent of several $billion trying to seal it in stone. If you want to understand why the wealthiest dynasty in American history collapsed into nothing in less than a century, stay right here, because this is the story nobody has told correctly. And if this is the kind of history that makes you see the present a little differently, hit like and subscribe, because there is a lot more where this came from. To understand what the Vanderbilts were building toward, you have to understand what they were building away from. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man who started it all, was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a farmer and a ferryman's daughter. He had almost no formal education, and he spent his early years working the waters around New York Harbor with a ferocity and a cunning that would define everything that came after. By the time he was in his 40s, he had muscled his way into the steamship business, and by his 60s, he had pivoted into railroads and built a network that controlled the movement of goods and people across the northeastern United States. He was not charming. He was not refined. He once wrote to 2 business partners who had betrayed him with magnificent directness that he would not sue them because the law was too slow, and that he had already set about dismantling them. He made good on that promise. By the time Cornelius passed away in 1877, he had accumulated somewhere close to $100 million of fortune that in today's terms would be worth well over $3 billion, and he had done it entirely on the strength of his own relentlessness and brilliance. The Commodore, as he was called, could not have cared less about society. He did not need anyone's approval. He had built something out of nothing, and the opinion of New York's drawing rooms was not something that registered on the scale of his concerns. But he had children, and his children had grown up watching their father command every room he entered while simultaneously being frozen out of the rooms that mattered to a certain kind of ambition. Old New York, the New York of the Astors and the Livingstons and the Schuyler's families whose money had been sitting still and accumulating dignity for generations, regarded the Vanderbilts with a particular kind of contempt that is unique to people who have never had to work for anything. The money was real, they acknowledged. The family was not yet. And that distinction, quiet and devastating, planted itself in the Vanderbilt children like a splinter that could not be reached. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited the bulk of his father's estate in 1877, and he did something extraordinary with it. In just 8 years before his passing in 1885, he doubled it. He was a genuinely gifted manager of capital, and he grew the family fortune to something close to $200 million, making him briefly the wealthiest man in the world. But William Henry was also the first Vanderbilt to be visibly confessionally uncomfortable with his own wealth. He told people directly that money made him anxious. He looked at the comfortable working families around him and felt something he described as envy. He built a grand mansion on Fifth Avenue and filled it with European paintings and imported furniture, and he still felt somehow that something was missing. The fortune was enormous. The legitimacy it purchased was still incomplete, and when he was gone, he handed the problem along with the money to his children. His son, William Kissam Vanderbilt, known as Willie, married a woman in 1875 who had been thinking about exactly this problem since she was a girl. Alva Erskine Smith, had grown up in the American South watching her family's antebellum wealth evaporate after the Civil War, and then in France watching European aristocracy move through the world with a kind of settled, unhurried authority that money alone could not replicate. She understood with absolute clarity that the Vanderbilts did not need more money. They needed architecture. They needed events. They needed to force the old guard to come to them on their terms in rooms so extraordinary that refusing the invitation would be socially impossible. In 1883, she and Willie hosted a costume ball at their new Fifth Avenue mansion that was attended by 1,200 guests, including members of families who had spent years pointedly ignoring the Vanderbilt. Caroline Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, came. It was the moment the gates finally opened. But Alva was not satisfied with one party in one house. In 1888, she instructed their architect Richard Morris Hunt with language that tells you everything about what was driving this family to build the very best living accommodations that money could buy. What Hunt produced was Marble House, completed in 1892 in Newport, Rhode Island, a 50-room summer cottage that cost $11 million, of which $7 million went solely toward importing 500,000 cubic feet of marble from America, Italy, and Africa. Willie gave it to Alva as a birthday present. A 50-room marble palace as a birthday present, not because either of them needed another house, not because Newport was convenient, but because the Astors had Newport and the Vanderbilts intended to surpass them. The dining chairs at Marble House were cast from bronze covered in gold leaf and weighed 75 pounds each. A footman was required to assist guests in being seated. No detail was too much. No statement was too loud, because the statement was the point. What happened next is almost too on the nose to be believed, but it happened. Within months of Marble House being completed and declared the finest private home in America, the original summer home of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Willie's older brother, burned to the ground in Newport. And before the ashes had cooled, Cornelius hired the same architect, Richard Morris Hunt, and instructed him to rebuild at any cost a house that would surpass his brother's. The new breakers, completed in 1895, had 70 rooms and 12 acres of grounds overlooking the Atlantic. It cost $7 million, rather less than Marble House, but it was larger, and in the competition the Vanderbilt brothers were running against each other, scale was the metric that mattered. Two brothers, two stone palaces, one architect, and a question that neither of them ever thought to examine directly: what exactly are we trying to win? George Vanderbilt watched this from a distance, and in some ways he seemed genuinely different from his siblings. He was shy and intellectual, far more interested in philosophy and literature than in social warfare. He spoke several languages. He had a private library of over 10,000 volumes that he had cataloged obsessively since the age of 12. He found Newport and Fifth Avenue exhausting and had no particular desire to compete with his brothers for status in the rooms his family had already claimed. What he wanted, he said, was simply a place of his own, somewhere quiet and beautiful, a retreat from the pressures of being a Vanderbilt. In 1888, he traveled with his mother to Asheville, North Carolina, fell in love with the scale and silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and began purchasing land. He eventually bought 125,000 acres. His quiet country retreat, when it was finished in 1895, contained 250 rooms. It had a library with a concealed spiral staircase, a bowling alley, an indoor swimming pool, a gymnasium, a banquet hall with a ceiling 7 stories high, and a collection of art that included paintings by Renoir and Monet purchased on tours of Europe with his architect. The gardens were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who had created Central Park, and covered 75 acres of formal and informal landscape. The construction employed over 1,000 workers for 6 years, required a dedicated brick kiln built on site, a woodworking factory, and that 3-mile private railroad. When it opened on Christmas Eve, 1895, it was the largest privately owned home in the United States, a title it holds to this day. George would have resisted the suggestion that Biltmore was anything like Marble House. He was not trying to intimidate anyone. He was not competing with his brothers. He genuinely loved books and forests and the science of sustainable agriculture, and Biltmore was, among other things, one of the first estates in America to practice systematic forestry management under the young Gifford Pinchot, a man who would later found the United States Forest Service. George Vanderbilt had real intellectual substance, and Biltmore reflected it. But it also reflected something else, something he may not have fully recognized: the same compulsion that had driven Alva to her marble and Cornelius to his 70 rooms. George needed a place that was unmistakably, inarguably, permanently his. A place so significant that the world could not overlook it. A place that said in limestone and in Olmsted's careful gardens and in 10,000 catalog books, here is a Vanderbilt, and here is where he belongs. The cost of that belonging was relentless. Biltmore required a permanent staff of approximately 80 servants and cost around $6,000 a month simply to operate at a time when that was a genuinely staggering sum. George had inherited money, but he had no operating business to replenish what the estate consumed. He was drawing down a fixed resource against an appetite that never reduced. By 1902, an economic downturn had made the situation untenable, and George and his wife Edith were forced to close the estate entirely and retreat to Europe. For a house that had been intended as a permanent statement of arrival, the silence must have been disorienting. George passed away in 1914 unexpectedly at the age of 51 from complications following what should have been a routine medical procedure. He left his wife Edith holding the most expensive challenge in America. Edith was a capable and clear-eyed woman, a descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, the first governor of colonial New York, and she understood immediately that the fantasy of Biltmore as a self-sustaining private paradise was over. She sold 87,000 acres to the United States Forest Service for $5 an acre, land that today would be worth hundreds of millions, creating the core of what is now Pisgah National Forest. She sold more land as the finances demanded. She ran the dairy farm and the remaining operations as tightly as she could. But the house was still there, and the house still had to be fed. In 1930, Edith and George's daughter, Cornelia, who had grown up at Biltmore as the last resident of a fading empire, opened the house to paying visitors. The city of Asheville had asked for the opening to boost tourism during the Great Depression, and the financial reality left Cornelia with very little choice. What had been built as the ultimate private statement, the definitive proof of Vanderbilt permanence and legitimacy, became a tourist attraction. $1 admission, and anyone could walk through the rooms where the argument had been made. Back in Newport, the same logic was playing out with the same quiet efficiency. Marble House, that $11 million birthday present, was sold in 1932 for $100,000. Less than 1% of what it had cost to build 4 decades earlier. The Breakers was eventually transferred to the Newport Preservation Society, a handover in all but name from a family that could no longer sustain the running cost. The great Fifth Avenue mansions were taken down across the 1920s and 1940s, their facades broken up, their interiors stripped and sold at auction. Of all the properties the Vanderbilts built during the Gilded Age, the ones that survive are the ones that were handed over to the public to maintain. And then there was 1973. In that year, the surviving members of the Vanderbilt family gathered for a reunion. They looked around the room at each other, at the descendants of the man who had once been the wealthiest person in the world, and they made a discovery so quiet and so stunning that it almost defies belief. Not one person in that room was a millionaire. A fortune worth $3 billion in today's terms had been built, divided, and spent across 3 generations, and what it had been spent on more than anything else was houses. Dozens of them. Houses in Newport, houses in New York, houses in France, houses in the Carolinas. Houses built not because they were needed, but because they were necessary, because the family had confused the two things so thoroughly and for so long that the distinction had ceased to exist for them. There is an explanation that gets offered for dynastic collapses like this one, and it runs roughly as follows: the first generation makes the fortune, the second maintains it, and the third spends it. The Vanderbilts followed this pattern in one sense, but the pattern misses the deepest thing. The fortune was not spent carelessly. It was not lost at cards or thrown away or given to strangers. It was deliberately, purposefully, architecturally invested in a project, and the project was legitimacy. It was the purchase of a permanent place in the social order of a country that officially had no social order, but which operated in practice with a hierarchy as rigid and as unforgiving as any in Europe. The Commodore had forced his way into that hierarchy through sheer economic power. His children and grandchildren tried to cement the position through stone, and they discovered too slowly and too expensively that it does not work that way. Old money families looked at Marble House and the Breakers and Biltmore and saw exactly what they were. They saw effort. They saw the visible anxiety of people who were trying too hard. And in the world the Vanderbilts were trying to enter, visible effort was precisely the wrong signal. Legitimacy in that world came only from time, from the casual inherited assumption that you belonged, an assumption so deep it did not need to be expressed and so old it did not need to be defended. You cannot build that assumption with any amount of marble. You cannot commission it from any architect, however brilliant. You cannot landscape it into existence across any number of acres, however beautifully managed. It is the one thing in the world that money genuinely cannot buy, and the Vanderbilts spent a generation's worth of wealth discovering that fact. The Commodore himself would not have understood the problem because the Commodore did not have the problem. Building his actual empire to worry about whether Caroline Astor was going to invite him to dinner. He made the money. He left the question of what the money meant to other people. And other people, specifically his children and grandchildren, answered that question in the most expensive way imaginable. Biltmore still stands today, and it is genuinely extraordinary. More than 1 million people visit it every year, and when you stand in the shadow of its limestone facade and look up at the French Renaissance towers against the blue of the Carolina mountains, it is almost impossible not to feel something that you might call awe. George Vanderbilt's descendants still own it, and they have turned it into a thriving enterprise with hotels and a winery and restaurants on the grounds which George himself had once envisioned before his passing made that dream impossible for him to see. The estate has endured, in other words, by becoming the very thing it was built to transcend: a public spectacle, an attraction, a place where strangers pay to see how the Vanderbilts once lived. There is something quietly heartbreaking about that. A house built to say we are permanent, we are significant, we have earned our place, now charges admission so that the people whose acceptance it once sought can wander through its rooms and take photographs. The argument is still being made 2 generations after there is anyone left to make it in limestone and in Olmsted's gardens and in the chandelier with 72 light bulbs hanging over a staircase that nobody climbs anymore for any reason except to see what it looks like. And if that is not a story about what money can and cannot do, about the difference between wealth and belonging, and about the kind of hunger that a fortune can feed for a generation but never actually cure, then I'm not sure what story is. The Vanderbilts built the greatest houses in American history. And in doing so, they answered the question they had been asking since the Commodore's children first felt the cold air of old New York's judgment. The answer was that there is no house big enough, there is no marble expensive enough, there is no garden beautiful enough to make the world receive you in the way you are hoping to be received. The Vanderbilts learned that in stone across 3 generations, and the houses, the beautiful, ambitious, heartbreaking houses, are still standing there to prove it. If this story landed with you, leave a comment below telling us which Vanderbilt mansion you think made the loudest statement of all, because the answer is not as obvious as you might think. And if you want more stories about the great American dynasties who built empires, lost fortunes, and left behind questions that nobody has ever quite stopped asking, subscribe and stay with us. There are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is worth your time.